I'm Matthew Phelps, co-author of the Turning to God's Word Bible study, Thus Says the Lord, God Speaks Through His Servants the Prophets. Today we'll be talking about Lesson 8 of our study, which covers selections from 2nd Isaiah. In our last lesson, we covered quite a few excerpts from, as we explained, 2nd Isaiah, this section kind of toward the end and kind of in the middle from the time point of view and toward the end from the book point of view, although there's 3rd Isaiah yet to come. We talked mostly previously about the excerpts that look at the future and the destiny of the people in exile. And talked a lot about the similarities and differences between the return, which is coming, and the Passover, which was really cool, but it is shockingly not the coolest part of 2nd Isaiah. So for today, we're going to talk about a few passages with a different character, a very messianic character. By way of introduction, a note on biblical scholarship and how some of this goes. There is, as we start to dig into the scriptures and when and how some of these things were written, there can be a tendency to get a little cynical about some of the ordering and timing. For example, when it starts to look pretty obvious that many of these prophecies were written, after the things happened. You can start to think, there's no real prophecy in the Bible, right? This is just a thing where it's people writing things after the fact to justify what has already happened. And there is some of that, and that's fine, because ultimately the Bible tells us truth, but it is not all literal or historical truth, nor is it all intended to be, which is fine. But what we have to avoid falling into is this trap that some scholars definitely do fall into that looks at the Bible just as an historical work like any other, and lose sight of the fact that it does have prophetic and predictive parts to it. Things that clearly and strongly foreshadow stuff that is not to happen for hundreds of years. And as we look at that, some of these selections from 2nd Isaiah are, I think, the most obvious. This and a couple of Psalms are probably the most obvious points in the Old Testament that we can look at to say, what on earth could this be talking about other than Jesus? Whenever you date this, right, we talked a little bit about there are people who maybe somewhat ponderously seem to think that all of Isaiah was written at the same time. We talked about that's highly unlikely. Even if you date 2nd and 3rd Isaiah later than 1st Isaiah, there is no way that this was written after Jesus. Zero chance. So when you date it is not really relevant for its effect in this case for its prophetic impact. So as we read through and look at these sections, we are very much going to be focusing on prophecy in the kind of generally thought meaning of predicting the future. We've already talked about that is not at all the entirety of what prophecy does, but it is an important part of it. Especially in the context of some of the things we talked about in the previous lesson in 2nd Isaiah, when you saw this major emphasis of God is the only God. And how do we know that? There are things we can do to test or to prove a God versus not a God. And one of those tests was, can you know what's going to happen? And if that is kind of the thrust of exactly this part of Isaiah, then by the prophet's own test, this prophet needs to be able to know what's going to happen in advance to demonstrate that God is the one true and only God. So kind of uniquely in 2nd Isaiah, it is necessary for the prophet to prophesy, to predict, because of the setup of what makes God God, as explained by this same prophet. So again, that is why we're focusing specifically on a predictive view here. Again, prophecy, more importantly, tells us something profound and true about God, which this also does. But in this case, somewhat uniquely, we're also going to be holding it to the test of, does it predict something? It does. So we'll look at that. And that's why. So, let's get into it then. Hey, well, as with some of these dense prophecies, we have less text, which is excellent, and we'll go a little slower, which is also very indicated. Beginning here of Isaiah 42, behold my servant, whom I have chosen, whom I uphold, my chosen, in whom my soul delights. Who's the subject? That's going to be a constant question as we go through this as well. God is talking about someone. And yeah, okay, it's easy to jump to the obvious answer. It's Jesus. Slap that Jesus sticker on it and move on, which I think sometimes we do, right? You take the shortcut, right? It's very easy, because we know where some of this is going, to take the shortcut and say, this is just talking about Jesus, problem solved, we're done. Another characteristic of prophecy, so I just talked a lot about, we're going to look at the predictive side of that, and if we're doing that, this is Jesus, problem solved, we don't even need to have any more of the study, right? Wrong. Because the other side of prophecy we've talked about and we'll keep talking about is, I like to think of this working in like a prismatic sense, right? You have, all around you, you've got white light that contains, 7 different wavelengths of light, whatever is in a rainbow, right? It's, 7. Good. That is not an important 7, by the way, probably for a Bible point of view. We'll not get lost in that. But you've got, right, these different hues or components that all contain into this single whole. Prophecy is like that, right? It has, within this prophecy, you have different manifestations that you can split out. And the prophecy is true as a whole, but you can filter out some views of it and take a different view of it, and it has different realizations or realities. So yes, this is talking about Jesus, and yes, we are going to talk about this talking about Jesus, but it is not only talking about Jesus. And that's where the question, who is the servant and what is the prophet telling us about, is fascinating and is worth digging into. For this text, and probably most of these, but we'll look at it as we go, I want to put forth the idea that this is also talking about this remnant of the people of Judah that are going to be returning. And I think most of these make some sense, in a good amount of sense in that context. But they also make at least as much and more sense in the context of Jesus. And you don't have to pick one or the other to be true. That's the important part about how this works, right? Maybe the Judah view of this is purple light, and the Jesus view of this is red light, and plus some others, and it all comes together, and you've got this white light of prophecy. And so as we study it, what we want to do is split it apart and look at some of these different views separately to try to get a better view of what the whole prophecy is like, and ultimately what it's telling us about God. And that's where you see the Jesus side. That red hue is maybe your predictive side and is important, but what you really want to see as you study prophecy is the white part, the whole, everything coming together, because that's the part that tells you something true and profound about God. So that's what we're doing. So first part of this, I think it's talking about this remnant of Judah, who has been in exile and oppressed and has been having a bad time. And God is saying, from this little remnant that is still currently in exile, non-violently, I'm going to bring about justice and peace to the earth. And I'm going to do it without force or resistance. We talked a lot previously also about without violence, right? We did it violently before. Now we're going to do it differently. Now we're going to do it peacefully. So there is still very much a talk of what God views the return as here. The return being nonviolent and the true intention of his people as expressed as far back as the Exodus and before, of these people being a light to all the nations and a role model and people that spread the truth of God to all the people. This remnant that's returning is meant to do that and is going to do some of that. But we know there's a limit to that, right? We know what happens. Spoiler. They don't convert all of the nations to following God when they get back to the Holy Land. So they do, to some extent, fulfill this. They expose the known section of the world to the idea of the worship of God. And more people do begin to worship God. And that practice spreads beyond just Jerusalem when they've returned. They do some of this, for sure. But does everyone come to know about God? Definitely not. They do it incompletely. Then you've got Jesus, who does it much, much more completely. Right? He does not act with violence. He does reach all of the nations with the message of God. He gets a lot farther than this isolated remnant from Judah gets. Does he completely solve all of this either? No. There's also a further future-looking manifestation and component to what this prophecy is, which continues to talk about the ongoing mission of the church as well. Right? We do this also. We are also, you and I, are also in this prophecy. This is also telling us our job and our mission on this earth. We're joined to Jesus. So you see this thread woven through past, less past, present, and future. That prophecy splits into these different hues and manifestations in different times and means the same core thing. What does God want his people to do? He wants us to show peace and justice to the world, to bring this true view of God to the world, and to do it non-violently, right? Not to do it this way where we pull out swords and we go conquer everybody and then say God loves you. Because, it's kind of hard for people to believe that when you have conquered them with the sword. But when you come offering no peace or resistance and say, God loves me and God loves you, it's a very different message. And although we maybe don't do it so much with guns anymore, how much of our effort to evangelize is still rooted in a sense of confrontation. Not everybody. There are a lot of great people doing great evangelical work in our church today, but there are definitely people who have some kind of chip on their shoulders who bring confrontation, argument, different forms of violence into this as well, right? Who would definitely not be able to say a bruised reed he will not break about, right? We're kind of bulls in a china shop. So there's guidance and direction for us today as we continue to carry out the mission of the church in this prophecy that is both about a remnant of Judah and more fully about Jesus Christ. So that's a lot, but this is a study, after all, about prophets and prophecy, and it is very useful to keep coming back to this core idea of what is prophecy and how does it manifest, especially in this section. and we'll keep doing so as we go forward, and probably throughout the study, continue to remind all of us, ourselves, of this core idea. That is a strong part about why the study doesn't stop before Jesus, right? If you've looked ahead, we go through the time of Jesus and even into the end times with Revelation, because these prophecies don't stop before or even with Jesus. The core of what each of these prophecies is, by its atemporal nature, persists through to the end of times. So I challenge all of you to try to adopt a kind of an atemporal view of how you look at these prophecies and look at how they can manifest not just once but across time. And that's where you'll really see who God is and what he's trying to do in the world. Building on the theme, we see first God introducing himself, and in some sense providing his credentials. What are those credentials? First, I created and stretched out the heavens, and then the earth, and then this fascinating line, who gives breath to the people upon it and spirit to those who walk in it. That could be one thing, or that could be two things, right? In that, we are moving around and living and breathing, and that is our essence and our life, and that could be all that it's talking about. But then there's this repetition, spirit to those who walk in it. Remember, we've talked about it in this study before, and we surely will again in the study and elsewhere, because it's a critically important theme in all of the scriptures. What is a human person? Going very far back to the second creation story, we see God forms out of clay, out of earth, this man. And it's still just a lump of clay, right? As earth alone, it isn't anything more than that. And then it becomes a human person when God breathes into it and infuses the divine life, breath, into this earthly thing. And so a human being, by nature and design, is a meeting of heaven and earth in a single person, in a single entity. We are both heaven and earth by design and by destiny. And God is here reminding us of that fact. We cannot live out our call and our destiny apart from God, because it is God's breath, God's life in us that makes us who and what we are. And when we try to separate ourselves from God, we separate ourselves from our call and from our identity and from our destiny, which is, in a very real sense, the problem of fallen humanity. In separating from God, humanity lost their pathway, their destiny, which was, Adam and Eve in the garden. There is a view of humanity that is, though we're not trying to get back to the garden. Important point. We're not trying to go back to what was. That is never how God works, right? We never go back. We see with the return, God doesn't try to create what was with the kingdom that was established before. He does, as this text talks about, he does a new thing. We never go back to what was lost, because God is always intending something better, right? The Garden of Eden is a pale shadow of the kingdom of heaven, which is the true destiny of humanity. Same with the kingdom. So many of these images, as prophecy works, are pointing toward this ultimate destination that so far surpasses all of these shades or images that there is barely any comparison. So we're not trying to go back. That said, contained in the identity of humanity is our destiny of joining earthly things to heavenly things, of joining in and participating as earthly beings in the reality and the life of God. And as we separated from God, we lost that destiny. And that is the tragedy of the Old Testament. God here reminds us of that core aspect of our identity. He talks about, through you, I want to reestablish that reality, right? I'm giving you as a covenant to the people, a light to the nations. It's not only for you that I'm working to restore this, it's through you that I'm working to restore this for everyone. Everyone I want to restore to that destiny, to take out of prison, to open their eyes. These different metaphors or images that describe the state of humanity separated from their core identity and their destiny, unable to see, enslaved, and various other images. God doesn't want that anymore. He never wanted it. He's doing something about it. And he's doing something about it through whoever this, his people, whoever those are, right? And that, again, is one of those things, one of those atemporal moving ideas, is who are the people of God, right? When this is written, it's this remnant from Judah. At the time of Jesus, it expands to followers of Jesus and continues to mean the church today. It means a lot of things and different things at different times, and that's fine. On that note, there's also this fascinating line, "Behold, the former things have come to pass, and the new things I now declare." We strongly emphasized in the last lesson that whenever God talks about doing a new thing, it is critically important. And usually it's pointing to a particular thing. If you look at this line right here, though, atemporally, then what you see is it's not just a one-time thing that new things are coming to pass. Right? This isn't talking about one time the people are about to return and their relationship with God is going to be different. Even the idea of a changing and evolving relationship with God here is a thing that can take that atemporal perspective. Right? There's a new thing about to happen that we've already talked quite a bit about when the people return. It is not like the Exodus. It is not like the Passover. It is done differently. It is not like the Davidic kingdom, nor is it even like the divided kingdom. It is new, but it is not final. And after that, there is yet a new thing coming. With Jesus Christ, there's a very new thing coming. There's a new covenant, new rules, new view of reality. And then, sorry, my cat is scratching. And it's adorable. Anyway, the church is also not the end point, right? It is also a midpoint, leading us all to... There will always be new things until we get to and fulfill that destiny that God has in mind for us. Our relationship with God will be ever new and ever fresh until and beyond then. Beyond then gets a little weird because there's not an after the end. And at that point, who knows what it's going to work like. But until then, as long as there's time, there's going to keep being new things. Because God may be immutable, but he is nonetheless ever fresh and ever new. And so that freshness, that newness, is another one of those key realities about God. It's easy to think about, static, still God, because he doesn't change in the sense that we tend to think about change. But what he's doing for us is constantly evolving because of our nature. And that's how we live, right? We live through change. Change is literally a constant and necessary part of our existence. And so God bringing us to our destiny is working through change. And so our experiences with God as we change and grow will be ever new and ever different. And that again is why these prophecies have these different manifestations in time, right? The core, the heart, the white part of this prophecy, the white light part of it doesn't change, right? It is God. It is quite literally the truth and the reality of God. And as it, through our changing history, manifests, it changes because we change. But the core of the reality of God does not change. Our experience of it, as we move through time, does. And that will always be true. And here we see that reality about God, right? The former things have come to pass, and new things I now declare. That is God working in our world, and always will be. There will always be new things. And our encounters with God will always lead us to new things. Maybe not huge new covenant level things every year, right? But as you and I grow and develop in our relationship with God and our journey, it will never get stale and it will never get old. It will always be new and different. And the writings and the commentaries of the saints constantly bear out that truth about relationship with God. Here we switch course a little. Same core ideas and way we're going to be interpreting this applies. We're looking now, however, not just at what's going to be, but what has been, right? Here we're talking about some of the history of these people. You see, you are my servant Israel, always a loaded word, because it can mean so many different things. We're looking back to what God intended with the relationship with these people. And if you remember, earlier, their version of evangelization was somewhat less peaceful, shall we say. And so they manifested God's love for his people in a way that is harder to always see love, right? Murder is not really usually seen as a love language. That was a little, sorry, I couldn't resist saying that, and it's not wrong. But again, right, as we see, it's our history and not God that changes. And so, yes, there was a time in human history where God's love for humanity manifested as us being violent. And his calling of people was, you'll note the imagery, although it uses weapons, it's your mouth as a sharp sword and a polished arrow that he kept in his quiver, right? It was, there's strength here, but it was not in its use and its exercise that God was there, right? God was present. People understood in a world full of conflict and violence, understood God as strength and protection, right? If you can be safe from your enemies and you can win when conflict becomes necessary, that is being protected and looked out for. That is God's love for you. When the political situation of the world has evolved enough that you have, or developed, let's not assume that it's better, has developed to the point that you have these larger nations, and you have, for smaller communities and nations, you have much less conflict, then suddenly it is much more possible to exist in the world without conflict of arms at least. The state of the world for the early nation of Israel did not allow for them to exist without violence toward their neighbors. That was the reality of the world. But as we're moving toward this return with relatively few governing and empowered nations, with the consolidation of rule, there is much, much less violence in the world. And now it is possible to live in the world and to serve God and to live much more free from violence. In our world, I think it's easy to take for granted, living in a large country that has very rarely known war and conflict on our own soil, it's hard to relate to a world where your neighbors are like the next town down, and want to wipe you out. It's hard for us to wrap our minds around that. So anyway, looking back, God talks about forming the original people and an original purpose. And also we see they whiffed on it, right? I have labored in vain. I have spent my strength for nothing and vanity. Yet surely my right is with the Lord, and my recompense is with my God. I blew it, but, I still remember that there was an idea there in mind that I didn't follow. And I should, right? There's again this idea of what is the destiny of these people. Where are they meant to go? So they didn't, at this time in the past, realize their destiny. That does not make it not the destiny of humanity, right? Again, God's view, God's vision is fixed, right? It manifests in different ways across different points in time, but the promise of our destiny is available to all people at all times, and it is always where God is leading it. So the people of Israel, as the people of Israel, whiffed. They didn't get it right? They had all of this opportunity and they said, no, we want this instead. It doesn't cancel that God is trying to lead humanity to that destiny that he has in mind. They don't personally get it at that point in time because they blew it, but it doesn't nullify where God is going. That's the nature of God's covenant with humanity, right? The covenants shape this thing that persists through all time for all people, right? When God forms, and it's really different, again, the covenant works the same way, right? It's different manifestations of one core promise from God, which is this destiny that he has in mind for humanity, which is union with him. He has destined us for him. And that is the core and thrust of the covenant, which again manifests differently across different points in time, but always means that core thing. We're destined for unity with God. So these people missed it, but they're saying there's still a way back, right? We can still find our way back onto the right path and continue to march toward that destiny that God has laid out for them and for us. So where are we going now? Now being at the time of 2nd Isaiah. We didn't get it right before, but we know from the nature of God and prophecy that that doesn't mean it's not happening. So what does it look like? Well, what it looks like is what we tried to do before, even though it didn't work, is not sufficient. And we're not just trying to do that anymore. We're not trying to just create people of Israel or Jacob. And we're not just trying to get the band back together here and return to what was. Because we don't do that, right? God doesn't do that. He does not go back, and he doesn't look back. He's always moving forward and doing something new. So it's great, people, that you like the idea of now that you're in exile, you think, gee, it sure would be nifty if we could go back to having our own kingdom and our own land, and we could just do things like we did before. This is the prophet and God saying, you might think that would be great, but we're not doing that. You're not doing that. I have something better in mind, but it's not going to be what was. How many times in our own lives do we adopt that same mentality with God, right? Gee, God, it'd be awesome if I could just go back to how it was. And that is a mentality that really is limiting on the power and promise of God. I know that's easy to say and harder to realize when really bad things have happened in our lives. But God is all-powerful, right? It is very presumptuous of us to think God can't do better than what he did for us in the past, especially if we liked it. So the people, they're not going to go back to just being one tribe anymore and just concerned with themselves. Same cat, different scratch pad. We're moving forward and into something new, as are these people. and we see more of the intention and destiny of God's people here. I will give you as a light to the nations, that my salvation may reach the end of the earth. We're not going to stop with one tribe, one race, one nation. We're going everywhere. And it's a call to all of us not to impose limits on an unlimited God when we think about what we want our lives to be. It can be so easy to get stuck looking back, and that is not how God operates, and that is not his call. When you really have faith, trust in God, that he has your best interest and the best interest of humanity at heart, and you have hope, expectation that he will bring good for you, those things necessarily orient our vision forward, right? Hope is the thing that leads us to look forward and not back. Why would you expect the past? Hope is forward-looking. So when we truly have that trust, that faith in God, we look forward and only forward. And we see these prophecies work that way as well, right? They're always directing forward, and humanity grows and develops and builds forward in time, not backward in time. It's never better in the past. It's always better moving forward. And that, as much as anything, is evidence of God's action in our world. That our relationship with him and the way that works and evolves moves forward over time. Here again, we see multiple manifestations of prophecy. At this point, I think the theme is probably established enough. Hopefully, many of you can read this and see that there is a manifestation of this that is talking about this remnant of people of Judah in exile. And I think probably, again, more obviously, we can look at it and see Jesus as well. I gave my back to those who struck me, and my cheeks to those who pulled out my beard. I hid not my face from shame and spitting. Right? It is very much descriptive of the events of the Passion. But it's also descriptive of the experience of a people in exile. Less so, but not. Yes, meow. It's dinner time almost. Anyway, multiple manifestations in time, right? But also, here we're entering the section that is most clearly foreshadowing Jesus and his passion. What do we see then? Because again, core idea, we learn something about God and our experience of God through these things. Well, the first point is, it's not always going to be rosy and fun. Right? God will speak to and guide and lead us. He wants to teach the people, all people, and he wants to use us to do it. Great. The way he teaches is now no longer through the infliction of violence, but through having it inflicted. It's an interesting thing. Due to the direction that humanity has gone, violence is a part of us. But it is not a part of our destiny, right? When we're all living in union with God, there will not be violence. Now there is. How do you root out of humanity that violence? The first step on the way is to stop inflicting it, which his people are coming to, more or less. To have it stop being inflicted is another matter entirely. And there is a large gap between no longer inflicting violence and having violence leave the world. And that gap is through till the end of time. So the fate of God's people, by necessity of where we're trying to move and our evolution along the way, is when we stop inflicting violence. That doesn't mean that violence vanishes from the world. And so we will still experience it. That is where we are. And we have to move through that to get to where we're trying to go. And so it is for God's people here in 2nd Isaiah, returning from exile, so it is for God himself when he came and lived among us, and so it is for us in different forms today as well. And it is the reality, and it's the thing that we have to be aware of and to cope with. And it is a form of how we teach, right? The text begins with teaching others, and then takes this transition to people are being violent toward you. Those aren't two themes. That's one thought. That's one idea. You manifest God's teaching of, I made a crack earlier about God's love language not being murder. This is how that actually works, right? Is God's love language, God does show his love by the endurance of violence, whereas he does not really through the infliction of violence. If I can take what you are dishing out to me, not saying that's always appropriate, or like things like you tolerate abuse, or there are things that you should not do in the name of this. We're not glorifying accepting violence in all forms for all reasons. That's not it, right? But there are circumstances and cases where God's love can be shown by offering no resistance. And Jesus modeled that for us. And that is, it takes discernment to know when that's appropriate and when that's a terrible idea. And there are times when that is a terrible idea. But there are times when that is a very holy and blessed act as well. Too complicated to talk about the difference in great length on a video like this. Just want to say, don't always assume that when bad things are happening, you should stay where you are at, and that's what God wants you to do. That is way too simplistic. But God does teach the world through how his followers respond to the world. And when they respond in a really not characteristic way that shows love toward all people, that is God's message and teaching in the world. He modeled it when he was here, and he constantly asks his people to model it as well. And that is where we go and what we're trying to do. And again, God will help, right? Who will contend with me? Let us stand up together. Who is my adversary? Let him come near to me. Behold, the Lord God helps me. God helps us and strengthens us, but the message is shifted, right? It's not Exodus, God with his strong arm will intervene and conquer all these people. It's he will strengthen me, but my experience of that is not going to be me as the aggressor. It's a fascinating shift, and it's one that potentially doesn't get enough thought or talk about as something that happened in the Old Testament. And why, right? We say there's this difference between the Old and the New Testament gods. It's not that simple. The Old Testament God was the same as we talk about in the New Testament God, and we got there before Jesus. We got there right here in 2nd Isaiah, a long time before Jesus. And again, what changed wasn't God, but the people. Anyway, repeating myself now. But God teaches the world through the way we interact with the world is kind of the core idea here. And so we are, the ultimate point of that, which is a little hard to swallow in terms of how big the ask is that we're called to model and to act like God. And that is how we teach the world. Here now we see something probably less predictive and more just general guidance and good advice. But also hard. It seems to always be. There is a caution here about trying to ourselves light our own way. The idea being that it is better to walk in the darkness, trusting God, when we can't see where we're going, than to try to walk by our own light, which fits very well with what we've been talking about with this prophecy, right? God is always moving forward and doing a new thing. And because God is all-knowing and we are not, we never know where that's going, right? So we are, in a very real sense, in our relationship with God, always walking in the dark. Even though we know God himself is the light and enlightens all of reality, which is true, that's in a different sense. Here in the sense of how prophecy and God manifests in time, we are necessarily always in the dark. We can use these prophecies to try to get a sense of who God is, to try to get a sense of where things are going, but it will always be a very blurry and vague sense until we get there. And by the time we get there, then there's something else coming. And so we are always, in a sense, walking forward into the dark. And we are called to trust in where God is leading us to do that. Which is all fine if that's what we do. Where the problems come up is where we say, I don't like walking in the dark, and I think I have this light that I'm going to walk by, right? I know what's right, and I can enlighten my path and my destiny. So there weren't electric lights back then, right? So you had two sources of light. You had the sun, which exists far enough away, even though that light is, technically speaking, caused by fire. They didn't necessarily know that, and it is a much purer and a non-violent form of light, right? It just comes, it gives you warmth, and it enlightens everything. Or you had fires. Fire is not calm. It can be harnessed and used such, but it is, by its nature, it is destructive, right? Wherever there is fire, something is being destroyed. Something is being consumed. There's a huge difference. The sun just gives off energy, light, warmth. Fire consumes and destroys to do that. That's how we work when we try to set our own vision and our own destiny. Is that light we walk by is ultimately destructive and it consumes things. Whereas the light of God is warm and it provides and it gives, and it's relatively calm and peaceful. But if we say, I am not comfortable with trusting God to lead the direction of my life, and I'm going to pick a destiny for myself and walk by my own light, that will destroy and consume. We don't think it will, but it does. Inevitably, it does. And so that's the caution here, is it's better to not see everywhere you're going and to trust God than to try to walk by your own light. Having laid the core principle, we likely needn't spend an over large amount of time or depth on this last reading, but it's very worth saying. It is beautiful and fascinating, and it speaks for itself better than I ever can. So read it and reread it and reread it. This is amazing and powerful. And this is especially the section I talked about in the intro when I alluded to, you can see, I have a very hard time arguing that this is not predictive of especially the life of Jesus. It does have those other manifestations, right? The people of Israel are, of Judah, are beaten down and shamed and not seen as anything desirable or attractive among the nations living in exile in Babylon. The church today, one could argue, is in a very similar spot, more so by our own doing, unfortunately. Those who follow God do not always look pleasing to the eye. And bad things can happen to them, and they can do bad things that help further that. But at the core is this idea still of when we are serving God, and note, my servant shall prosper, right? If you're just afflicted and unfortunate and not serving God, then you have all the downside and none of the upside. And that can be true as well. So it is not true that when you are not thriving and prospering, God is necessarily with you and will be on your side. I think we sometimes think that, right? God is with all the afflicted. Yeah, but when it's self-inflicted and we're not serving God, there's only so much he can do about it, right? The destiny of all of the afflicted isn't for God to make it okay and lead them out of their affliction. He wants to, he's trying to, and the ultimate destiny of all people is that. But the particular outcome for some people is just you're in a bad spot and you're going to stay in a bad spot. But for those of us who are serving God, who find ourselves in those times, God has our back, and there's some great things can come from that. So we see this remnant in Judah. We see God brings a great thing from people who were totally conquered and living outside of their home. From that, God returns and restores them and leads countless people to his worship, and ultimately brings his promised Messiah and changes the entirety of human existence as a result of it. Great things come from it. Jesus Christ, in suffering his passion, is that looks like utter defeat and conquest by the world of God. It looks like the world won, and yet the greatest victory ever achieved is brought out of it. You cannot lose when you are serving God. There is no force that this world has that is stronger than God. He doesn't have to exercise force through violence because he is so radically stronger than anything we can do that his power, it doesn't have to be violent because it's so infinitely greater than anything we can do. He doesn't have to fight back to win. He can literally do close to nothing and win. Jesus shows he can endure anything that we try to throw at him, and his power superabounds, right? It's so much greater and above anything that we do that he wins. He does almost nothing and wins. And he does it that way for a reason, right? He could win easier, right? Or in a way that's more relatable to us, right? Jesus could have called a fiery sword down and cut himself off the cross and started murdering Jewish leaders. Very easily, that is possible. That is not what God is trying to achieve or to do. And so instead, he let us think we won. He let us do everything in our power against him to show the utter powerlessness of our way, right, of what we think is right. We just talked about walking by your own light and how destructive it can be. That leads to trying to kill God, right? But those things that destroy and consume us don't touch God. So he takes that full force, in order to enlighten us, he takes that full consuming destructive force that we generate in the world when we try to go our own way, and he lets all of that manifest and play out against him to show us that ultimately he can walk through the fire and not be burned. He can be totally untouched by that because he is so much greater than we are. And the same holds true, although it can be harder to see, of his church. It's harder to see because individual members of his church can be as flawed as those Jewish leaders who put God to death. But the church is composed of more than individual people, and there is at its core something built by and in union with Jesus Christ that has that same property, that all of the fire and violence and conflict of the world from without and within can be turned against it, and yet it will emerge victorious. As did a remnant of the tribe of Judah that was exiled to Babylon and yet emerged and refounded their nation. Admittedly differently, but it was reestablished. God can win against unsurmountable odds with seemingly no effort, and will continue to do so. And when we are servants of God, so too can we, is the message here. Again, impossible to do justice to the beauty of this prose and prophecy as we talked about it. It is the same theme, but it tells us, this gives us a view of Jesus so different from the Gospels, right? The intro talks about this part of Isaiah sometimes being referred to as the fifth Gospel because of the view of Jesus it gives us. And it's not the one you see in the Synoptic Gospels, and it's not the one you see in John. And it is such a powerful depiction of Jesus. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief, and as one from whom men hide their faces, he was despised. After the fact, no one would ever write that about Jesus. Knowing that he's God, you just wouldn't write it, even if it was true. But before, you can write it, because you're not writing it about a guy you knew, who rose from the dead and saved all of humanity. You can, in some ways, through the eyes of prophecy, you can better write about the experience of Jesus' lived life on earth than anyone would dare to after the fact, which is just fascinating. And so it gives us a different view, a sad view of Jesus. You don't get the sad view when he is risen in his glory. Because when you know how it ends, you see it differently. But beforehand, this is not, the life of Jesus on earth is not a happy thing to celebrate. It is now to celebrate for what it did. But at the time, it's not maybe how we tend to. It can be easy to see in the Gospels, Jesus hanging out with his buddies for 3 years and traveling around. And that can look not awful. Here we see a strong indicator that it was kind of awful. And I think if we reflect much on what that must have been like, of course it was, right? So many people were against what he was trying to do and were against him. Yes, some people bought into his message, but even going into the Passion, he rode into Jerusalem, the crowds praised him, and in a matter of days later were crying for his blood. He was not well loved of the people. At best, he got caught up as a fad, and people were kind of bandwagoning. Not that anyone would ever do that today. And he knew how fickle and how uncommitted. I mean, even one of his closest disciples denied him 3 times. It was a hard life that Jesus lived. And it's fascinating that we can potentially show a more true version of how hard it was before it happened than we would do after. It's a neat thing. Neat is maybe a wrong word for what this is, how this is manifesting, but this is important. And it is precisely important because it's easier to say some things before Jesus was than after. More on the theme. Oppressed and afflicted, yet he opened not his mouth. Again, there is much that Jesus could have done differently. Although he had done no violence and there was no deceit in his mouth, right? He could have manifested power in any way that it's possible to manifest power. And he chose endurance as that way, and submission. Not things that we tend to think of as power. And only submission to a degree, right? He allowed people to torture and kill him. He did not submit to their view of reality, right? Again, no deceit in his mouth. He did not submit to or accept anything false. He never said they were right to be doing what they did. He didn't cave. He didn't ever say he wasn't God. He continued to hold to truth, so he didn't submit to their view of reality. He did submit to the consequences that they imposed on him because he didn't submit to their view of reality. So it's not a submission in terms of a surrender. It's just, this is the outcome of me continuing to hold to my position that basically I'm God. And if this is what comes of that, well, you're all going to see that I am. And they kept thinking, well, if I were God, I would be doing something to get myself out of this situation. And that's the point. They're not God. They don't get it. And they ended up doing a horrendous thing as a result that he let them do. And why? Stricken for the transgression of my people, right? He didn't do this for him, right? God didn't need to win a victory over humans to prove anything, right? That proves nothing. He did it for us. And this text, much less so than the Gospels, explains why. But it does talk about him as a lamb led to the slaughter, which highlights the sacrificial nature of what he's doing. So it lays some of that groundwork, but the logistics and the what of what comes of that is left for the Gospels. But the nature of what happens as sacrifice for the good of the people, willful sacrifice being foretold here in Isaiah long before Jesus Christ, is astonishing. And I think that's probably for us the main thing to focus on here is the degree to which the experience of the Passion of Jesus Christ is foreshadowed. It takes till long after the fact before we start to have, or at least till after the fact, till we start to have any, as normal people, any true comprehension of what that achieved and how. But the author here sees that it is for the good of all people that he will die, surrender and die, and that it is a sacrifice and that he is the one being sacrificed. It's fascinating. Anyway, the text adds far more beyond that than I can. It is, and it continues to highlight the utter lack of violence or resistance, right? That is God's love for us. So here we get, to the extent this text talks about it, the how, right? Or the what this accomplishes. And it does foreshadow an idea that, or establish an idea that really isn't realized for these people until Jesus Christ, which is that the death of a person, and not just the death of an animal, can achieve, can cancel out iniquity and sin. That a person can act in the same role as a sheep for the sake of helping the people to atone for their sins. Or not even the people doing it. A different person can accept, as the lamb symbolically does. Not so symbolically can the person accept the consequences and the weight of that sin, and can nullify it, right? Can cancel it. Without showing all the details of how that works, the core of the gospel message is right there. A person can willingly assume the guilt of all of the people, and with the right circumstances met, can achieve atonement for those sins. It can't be any person, and again, without going into all the details, the letter to the Hebrews is a great place to go if you want more of that information. A lot of preconditions had to be met, up to and including Jesus Christ himself being sinless and God, and a priest, and many other conditions for this to work. Not anybody could have done this. Only Jesus could have done it, but the framework was there for a person to act in that role and to achieve that nullification of sins, not just individual sins, but we talked about the state of humanity being cut off from our destiny, right? Which is to be with God. He doesn't just make my personal, the fact that I don't know, stole some office supplies from work or whatever, little thing that I did, okay. He changes the destiny of every person who comes into contact with the effect of what he did. It's not just the nullification of personal sin. It is a large-scale restoration of the destiny of humanity. It's a fundamental change to who we are and where we're going, which again requires that we follow him to get to. It's not de facto, we're all just fine now. There's a way, and Jesus Christ is that way. And if you walk in that way, you can now get to where you were intended to go. But you still have to take that hard journey, which looks shockingly similar to the one that Jesus took. So you shouldn't expect it to be all rainbows and unicorns. But the destination is worth the journey. And that's ultimately where we see and how this idea also manifests across time, right? Is for humanity to get to our destiny, there is this journey in this pathway that we have to take at any point in time, be it back at the tribe of Judah, even before that, wandering in the wilderness through the Exodus, or Jesus Christ himself or our church today. The journey that leads humanity to our destiny is ultimately through wilderness and suffering and trial. And the only consolation in that is that it is guaranteed to be worth it. And that's a better place than most. And this lesson, that is our call for reflection, is these prophecies show us the one and only possible journey that leads us to God. What it looks like, how it works, what we need to do. And it was the same journey back when these prophecies were made as it was for Jesus Christ, and it is for you and I. This has been an overview of Lesson 8 of the Turning to God's Word Bible Study. Thus says the Lord, God speaks through his servants the prophets. For more information, consult our written study and visit us online at turningtogodsword.com.